Hi, everybody. Today, we're going to be building an album viewer using SwiftUI, Apple iTunes API, URLSession, and also using Codable and AsyncImage. On the right here, you can see an app that displays an album cover, has the title of the album, and a whole bunch of different song titles from that given album. This is from Drake. Before we get started with coding, I'd like to take a look at the Apple iTunes API, some of the requests and responses. The first thing I'm going to do is expand this window and we'll take a look at this API request. So here we're making a request and we're adding the search terms Taylor Swift and the entity is song. With this particular request, we're getting all the albums by Taylor Swift. And if we take a look at the response here, we got a result count of 35. And you can see a collection. A collection in the iTunes API is considered an album. And most importantly, you can find here a collection ID. So in order to get that particular album's songs and to get that album, which would be Taylor Swift's bonus tracks version, we would need to copy down the collection ID, which is 144,091,3923. Let's take a look at the API request to request the songs for a given album. You can see here that the format is itunes.apple.com/lookup. You put the ID of the collection or the album, and you say entity equals song. You'll notice something very interesting about the response. It provides you with a result count of 16, but the first response is actually an album. So the first entry in the array is the information about the album. The other entries in the array are all the tracks within the album. Using Codable, we'll find a very clever way of differentiating between a song and an album. Now that we know the structure of our JSON, it's time to create our app. So I'm going to click Create New Project. I'm going to select App. Then I'm going to create an app called Album Viewer. I'm going to make sure that it's a SwiftUI project. I'm going to click Next, save it on my desktop. The first thing I'm going to do is create the structs to handle the API responses from the server. So the first struct I'm going to create is track, which corresponds to a song. I'm going to make it codable, which means that it will automatically be serialized into an object. I'm going to add some elements from the API response, including track ID. The track ID is really important when we are creating a list of songs to uniquely identify them. It's actually a requirement of a Swift list. The next thing I'm going to include is a track name. And the track name is going to be added to the list. And lastly, I'm going to add collection name. As I mentioned before, the collection name is an album name. I'm now going to create a struct for the album. I'm likewise going to use Codable for the album data. I'm going to add collection type. Note that songs don't include a collection type, so that's how we're going to be able to differentiate our albums from our songs. Then I'm going to add the artwork URL for the album. And lastly, the collection name, which is the album name. I'm now going to add structs to track the album responses and the track responses from the server. I'm going to add an attribute to track the result count. And I'm going to add another attribute to store the array of albums that's returned from the server. As we saw in the JSON response, there's only one album that's going to be returned. Now we're going to create a struct for the track list. We're also going to add a result count. And we're also going to store the list of songs. The problem with Codable is that if one of the elements doesn't match up with what we've defined in terms of tracks and albums, then the whole process will fail. In order to avoid this, I'm going to add a snippet of code to ignore failures. As you can see, I've included the Stack Overflow link, so you can refer to it too. This property wrapper will help us ignore failures while trying to use Codable. I'm going to use ignore failure on a track response because one of the results is an album. I'm also going to add it to album response because I only want to capture the album in the list of album and songs. Now that we've defined the data structures, it's now time to build our UI. I'm now going to replace the VStack with text, an async image to represent the album cover, and a list to represent the list of songs. Now I'll create some state variables to capture the tracks, the album art, and the album title. Now I'm going to replace the text with album title and async image to album art. As you can see, the UI is completely empty, so we're going to use the iTunes API to load some data into the UI. While we're fetching data from the iTunes API, we don't want to burden the main thread. So we're going to use a pattern called async await in order to fetch the data asynchronously. As soon as the data is available, it will populate the text, the async image, and a list. First, we need to define the iTunes URL in order to fetch the Drake songs and album. Programmatically, the guard statement there is to make sure the URL is correct and our app doesn't crash. Then we're going to use do catch in order to make a request to the server using URL session and then decode the responses for both albums and songs. First, I'm going to try to make a request to the URL using URLSession. Then I'm going to try to decode the responses using tracks and albums. Then I'm going to use the list to present the song titles. You'll notice that it says cannot find tracks in scope. The problem is I put the curly brackets in the wrong spots, and therefore load data is not part of content view. So I'm going to delete a couple of curly brackets and reposition them in order to make it part of content view. Now that we fixed that problem, let's add the album response. As we saw in the JSON earlier, the album array only has one element. So what we'd like to do is to extract the art and the title from that album array. So I'll type in album art equals the album art of the first element. And for the album title, we're going to add the collection name. By default, the iTunes API allows us to receive album art of 100 by 100 pixels. What we're going to do is to request the album art of 800 by 800 pixels by replacing the file name. Now, if I refresh my preview, I should be able to see the album art in the title. As you can see, there's formatting issues. So let's fix our layout. First, I'm going to add a gray square that I've downloaded from the internet into my assets. Now I'm going to reformat async image and add a placeholder. Now we're going to format the album title. Now you can see that we're correctly displaying the album art and album title. Now we just need to display the song tracks. I'm going to create a VStack, and I'm going to display the track name and the collection name. Now I'm going to add some code to highlight the track name. And that's it, we're done. As you can see in this sample, we made a request to the iTunes API. We were able to extract the album data and the song data separately, populated the title and the album art, and the list of songs as a list.